So you often see the statistic where 95% of traders lose. It's bandied around a lot. People quote it all of the time as to say how hard trading is. But the reality is, when you look underneath the surface, that is not true. All of the data that's available points to a situation that's completely different from that scenario. And in fact, regulation that was introduced to highlight the risks of trading actually ended up doing the opposite. It showed you that the statistic that says that 95% of traders lose money is completely false. So in the process of researching this video, I thought I would go out and try and find where that 95% of traders lose statistic comes from. And the fact is, I cannot find it. There is no source or link to the source of a study that says that. Now, what you sort of are finding here is that because it's a nice headline grabbing number, it's a good number to sort of pump out, which is why I used it on this video. It's true. But what happens is it sort of echoes and reinforces itself over time so that people fall into that trap of using it. And especially when, you're looking at doing a service or something, people sort of say, 95% of traders lose, but use my service and you won't be one of those 95% or something like that. So yeah, it's sort of become a mythical figure within trading circles that 95% of traders lose, despite the fact that nobody can actually prove it. Now, you could use a variety of statistics to manipulate the figure to make it look like that, but the reality is somewhat different, as you will see in a second. But when you're active and in a market, you need to look at the market and sort of say, where do I sit within the distribution of profits and losses within this market? In my office, I have a thing called a Galton board, and the idea of the Galton board is it shows a normal distribution. What is a normal distribution? Well, it's the distribution, as the name suggests, of a set of outcomes. So when we're talking about a betting or trading market, on one side of the bell curve, you will actually have all of the losers. On the other side, you will have all of the winners. And your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to be on the winning side. But the interesting thing is there's a thing in here about market efficiency as well, because if you say to anybody the market is efficient, then of course, when you look at it from that really broad perspective, it's always going to look efficient because you've got really terrible guesses from people who really can't be bothered to do anything interesting on this side. And on the other side, you've got people that are quite smart, have put the effort in, and are trying to make the best guess that they possibly can. If you add those up and divide them by 2, they're always going to be bang in the middle. The market's going to look efficient. Now, there's a book I read a few years ago called Super Forecasting. Read that if you want to dig deeper and understand sort of what I've just said there, because I found that book years after I figured out that what you do to get onto the correct side, onto the winner side of the bell curve, is you just try and not make mistakes. You use sensible staking, you do all of the right things, you work hard, you're looking for little edges, you're trying to nudge yourself over on that side. When we look at that Galton board, what we've done is rather than letting it settle into a normal distribution, all we're doing is we're just tipping it slightly in our favor, and that massively affects the way that the outcomes work in your favor over the longer term. But in terms of, 95% of traders lose, that's just a made up statistic. It doesn't seem to have any particular basis. But there is actually information published that gives you the exact number that you should be looking at and a better understanding. In fact, there's loads of academic evidence and research that shows you all of these things. So let's have a look at some of that. So one of the problems that you have with statistics is that they tend to be interpreted slightly differently, and people use them to push agendas. So you would have seen a statistic saying one particular thing. You must have seen this if you're involved in gambling one way or another. And people sort of make up or bend statistics according to whatever suits them. And, this is probably the only time in my life I will ever thank a European regulator for bringing some clarity to a situation, because in 2011, there was an institution set up called ESMA, or the European Securities and Markets Authority. I think that's what it stands for. I may stand corrected on that, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And the idea was they were set up to regulate financial markets, and more particularly in line with sort of consumer protections. They introduced a mandate in 2018 that meant that anybody that offered CFDs to retail investors, stroke speculators, would have to publish the number of accounts that actually lost. And the idea was to raise awareness of how much risk you were taking if you were going to start trading CFDs. So the next question has to be, what is a CFD? Well, a CFD stands for contract for difference. If you buy shares in the UK in a company, you tend to have to buy a lot of them in order to make any reasonable amount of money. And the worst thing is you actually have to pay tax on your share purchase. I find this absolutely incredible, really, that you're taxed on making an investment. Anyway, that's another video. But when you buy a CFD, it's a highly leveraged position on the underlying asset. So you could buy 10,000 Vodafone without having to put up that capital. You just have to pay the difference between when you buy and when you actually sell them. And that's why it's called a cash for difference. And in fact, very often what happens is it's a sort of a derivative product. So it may mean that you're not actually buying the shares, but it is tied to that share's value. I'm not going to go into great depth on CSVs. Basically, it is a trading tool that you can use if you want to trade indexes, shares, commodities, or any of those other things. It's a very popular way of speculating on financial markets. But because they were sort of quite a speculative and leveraged instrument, ESMA decided that they would get people to publish this list of how many accounts actually lose. And that's what provides us this insight and framework to actually understand if 95% of traders do actually lose, certainly on financial markets. And the fact is they don't. When you look at the list of brokers, which I shall bring up on the screen, you will find that a lot of them report numbers way below that 95% loss rate. Now, the majority of people within those markets still continue to lose money overall, and that is because of this bell curve effect and the fact that commission and frictional costs are involved within that particular process. But you can see there's quite a wide range from one broker to another in terms of the amount of people that actually have losing accounts over the course of the year. And I actually think this is quite a good thing because it focuses people in on people that are more likely to give you better tools, better education, better knowledge, and lower frictional costs in order to actively trade. But one of the key things that came out of this reporting mechanism is that there are no brokers where 95% of traders lose. And in fact, the best brokers actually have a rate substantially below that number. So all of the data that we've been looking at the moment are on financial markets. And the only reason we've used that is because ESMA basically forced brokers to publish that data. So we have really good quality data there. We can actually say for definite that 95% of traders do not lose over the course of a year. And, you know, it would be actually quite fun if you could roll out this sort of thing into betting markets, because people could log on to their favorite slots or casino website and it would say on there, everybody loses. 100% of our clients lose money over the course of the year. Don't do it. But if you went on to sports betting sites, that number would not be 100% for sure. And if you looked at betting exchanges, that number would be even better, because on betting exchanges, the frictional costs are very, very small. And when you actively trade on a betting exchange, they're even smaller as a percentage of the total profit that you could get out of the market. They really are wonderful innovations. And because the frictional costs are so small, the chance of you making money means you only have a small hurdle to overcome in order to be able to become profitable. And that's why I've always recommended it and why I went headlong into this opportunity when it first came around, because I realized what I was looking at. But of course, this leaves the problem of, you know, exactly how does this translate into sports betting markets? And curiously, again, thanks to reports commissioned by interested bodies on the regulatory side or regulatory influencers within the betting market, have actually provided the answer to us. And everybody sort of assumes that gambling is this place where you simply cannot make money and you are going to lose money all over the place, and people moan about not getting paid out and stuff like that. But on the Gamble Aware website, I actually found a report that was commissioned by them to look at the specifics of basically how much people win and lose over the course of the year. And the interesting thing was actually about 20% of people, and this is looking at the worst case scenario, this isn't looking at betting exchanges, this is looking at, you know, the betting market in general. About 20% of people did actually end up over the course of the year. Now, of course, you had losers. And if you look at the distribution of those winners and losers, you can see that it's skewed slightly. And that skewness that you can see in there, the lack of that normal distribution that we saw on the Galton board, is simply because of the marginal costs, the spreads, the overrounds that the bookmakers and various other entities add in to the mix. If you shrink that down significantly, it actually makes that bell curve look an awful lot better. But this is pretty much like a worst case scenario. Even in a betting market, you find that 95% of people do not lose. So 95% of traders losing is an absolute total myth. It does not exist, no idea where it came from, and you could manipulate stuff to make it sound that way, but based upon all the official data that's available through the regulators, it is not true. And when you look at that, and then you look at betting markets, you begin to realize that it's very similar in betting markets. Now, the problem you have with betting markets is that bookmakers have very large edges, and that tends to work against people. But of course, your solution to that is to actually go onto a betting exchange, because when you're on a betting exchange, that edge is, absolutely wafer thin. So all you need to do is something slightly cleverer to be able to step over that in order to get yourself into a profitable situation. And also the level of complexity that people use has a direct result on it. I've actually got data from betting exchanges, but I can't publish it, I'm afraid. But you can sort of imagine that if you're just using a mobile phone and you're doing a bet, maybe at a football ground, it's fairly impulsive, you just slap a tenner on something. You can imagine that these people are at the lower end of what you could achieve when using a betting exchange. If you go onto the website, it's a bit more sophisticated and you're going to put a bit more effort into it, and you're probably doing something a little bit cleverer. That allows you to go up a step from there. And if you're using an API product like betangel, then that is putting you, the chance of ending up on the right-hand side of the bell curve is significantly improved because you're doing clever things. And when we say clever things, it could just be things like asking for a price. Or putting an order in the market at a level at which you think it will be matched. You're taking advantage of all of that melee of activity within the market in order to put yourself on the right-hand side of the bell curve. And if you can do that, you're going to stand a much better chance of being able to profit. And that is a fact.